the 80s were horrible and terrible and insufferable, and it was everything didn't make any sense and things got out of control, and so on and so forth. And you hear phrases like this, and actually this phrase is sort of making a resurgence, if I'm not mistaken, about the 80s being stupid and it sucked and everything was bad and everything was rotten. And before we listen to, and especially before we repeat such phrases, commonplace phrases, we should think at least a little bit whether there's any substance and any truth to it. And I think that while yes, of course, to some degree there was some substance to this claim, it's vastly exaggerated and it's never put into context. This typically comes in the context of the hair metal bands of the 80s that were putting on the makeup and the outrageous costumes and the music, and each one tried to outrage the other band. Of course, they're vying for an audience and for fame and fortune. So when something becomes normal and acceptable, you have to one-up it and you have to come up with the next thing. But even in the context of music, it wasn't so terrible. There were a lot of bands, a lot of good bands, a lot of great bands that came out in the 80s. You get Marillion, Toto, Metallica, Megadeth, The Cult, so many bands that came out. Maybe some of them already started in the late 70s, but around the 80s, after the 80s, there were many good bands, good musicians. But the world was developing. A lot of other things were happening. And that's why it is so important to put music in context. There was a general economic development, right? After late 70s, people started making money on the stock markets. Eastern Europe started to open up a little bit, the Russian bloc. A lot of the horrors and the atrocities in the communist countries was starting to go down. Of course, it didn't happen over one day. Bulgaria, for example, was terrible. There they had concentration camps till the last day, till 91. But in most of the Eastern Bloc, there was already an openness, right? There was Gorbachev with the glasnost. There was international commerce was starting to become much better and much easier, right? Because of the proliferation of technology. And then, of course, the technology has to sustain itself. So if there's a demand for goods, then we improve shipping, then the shipping industry improves, there's better ships being made, then we need to sell those ships. Obviously, these big cargo ships don't cost $1.25 in your corner grocery store. So for buying and especially planning and building such a ship, it has to justify its own existence and of course its cost. So someone has to pay for it. So the general state of the economy in the world improved a lot in the 70s. And another thing that we don't think about is that all of these things are they're nominal. What is 80s? What is 70s? It's arbitrary, right? Someone makes it sound like on January 1st, 1980, everything went to crap, which obviously didn't happen that way. But we do like to design or to designate periods by the decade, so it has some sort of significance to us. We can put the finger on it. But be it as it may, in general, the well-being, the financial freedom, let's just say, or the abilities of normal people, what you would call the middle class, which also today is starting to lose its meaning a little bit, because even within the middle class there's so many different levels. But the point is that normal everyday entertainment became attainable for the average people. Until then, working people, they were happy if they had what to eat and a roof over their heads and a shirt on their backs, right? In the 80s, it became normal, it became acceptable for pretty much everyone to go on vacation, to buy some things that were not necessities. A lot of people had hi-fi channels and turntables and speakers, amplifiers, televisions, VHS, video, cable television, MTV. So all of this happening made it easier both to consume and to produce music. And whenever something becomes massive, it becomes diluted. This is just the natural order of the world. And guess what? You don't want to hear something, just don't listen to it. It's that simple. Of course, certain things you can't escape. And that is really the crux of the phenomenon, is the herd, is the hive mind mentality of the masses. Something for whatever reason becomes famous, and then everybody repeats it and monkeys it, and then for weeks and weeks on end, that's what you hear wherever you go, whenever you go. You get on the bus, you step into the bank, the supermarket, your friend's house, and everybody's playing the same song or the same 5 or 10 songs, and it just starts being too much. But that's not necessarily a hallmark of the 80s, right? Today it continues to some extent, a little bit less, because the internet made things much less centralized. When VHS came out and became attainable, then the music videos started. So everybody wants to produce a music video. So that's what it is in a nutshell. It's economic improvement. It's primitive, or let's just say cheap and easy entertainment becoming more common. And this is one of the consequences. But to make it, oh my God, the 80s were horrible, were terrible. I suspect that there is a little bit of a political or cultural political undertones, because Reagan was president, and he was president of the United States and the free world, and then the wall came down, so someone has to rain on that parade and make sure that people hate it, or that people are turned against it. But all in all, there was a ton of good music. There were record stores, music became accessible, and no one forced anyone to listen to any kind of crap. Very interestingly, I read somewhere, and I have a feeling that even if it's not entirely true, there is a lot of truth, that this idea, kind of this notion that everything in the 80s was crap, right? These outrageous haircuts, and it was sort of breaking out of a prison. But what I'm referring to is that this idea was popularized or made famous by Beavis and Butthead, which was kind of a funny TV series, a cartoon that was really nasty and ugly and low key, sort of a counter not counterculture, but a countering, or being against this whole idea of the 80s, when everything was overproduced and over made up, right? And we could see actually towards the end of the 80s, right, came out all of these bands. At the time they didn't call it grunge yet. The music press called it Seattle. Everything was Seattle. Queensryche was Seattle, and Guns N' Roses, even though they weren't actually from Seattle, but they were treated as Seattle. Wow, Guns N' Roses, they made it sound like it was the Messiah. There was something so new. In fact, it wasn't. They just stopped using these stupid production methods to make the drums and the guitars and all synthesized and so synthetic and inorganic. So there was this tendency to go back already towards the end of the 80s, or Twisted Sister, who were like super famous in the mid 80s, in 84, 85, when they came out. Everybody was cool with that, and they were even featured in some newspaper in Russia as the poster boys for American degeneracy, which of course to some extent was true. It just doesn't really justify taking away people's freedom and putting them in the gulags, right? So one doesn't justify the other, but if you have to choose, of course you would go with Twisted Sister's stupid makeup. Only after, in 87, everybody started making fun of them, right? But if they would have turned around and kept up a little bit and made their music a little bit more hard-edged and more organic, I think they would have continued for a little while. But again, back to Beavis and Butthead, the idea, what I wanted to say, that Beavis and Butthead in and of itself was kind of on purpose, very raw and brutish and kind of horrible looking, this low production, this bad animation on purpose. But it was very straightforward, very edgy. And I noticed a lot that there are people who hate Beavis and Butthead. They say that it's disgusting and it's stupid and it's idiotic and it's primitive. But The Simpsons, that's something amazing. The Simpsons is the new Crime and Punishment. It's a new War and Peace. And I hate sounding political, but it's typically people who are on the right side of the political spectrum will be more pro Beavis and Butthead, and people who are kind of more with the Simpsons tend to be on the left. Why is it? Because The Simpsons is fake. It's not really as intellectual as it purports to be. It's not so witty. It's not so smart. It's all pretense. It's all fake. It's really the 80s repackaged as not seeming to be the 80s, but that's exactly what it is. They're trying to be smarter and wittier and intellectual or than thou, whereas Beavis and Butthead is kind of hard hitting. And Beavis and Butthead, at least the way I understood it when I was watching it, was sort of an allegory for the public at large. The public is so stupid that they will buy anything, and the only thing that's in their mind is chicks and fast cars and doing trouble and having a good time. And then the teachers were each kind was kind of a stereotype of some certain type of American general stereotype, right? You had the ultra super liberal guy with the long hair with the peace symbol, and then you had the ex-Marine who was screaming at everyone and kicking them and screaming obscenities. So that's pretty much what it is. In reality, the 80s were not as horrible as everybody makes them make it sound. It made it a lot easier for a lot of musicians to make music, to distribute the music. Music in and of itself became much more popular. If you think about it, in the 70s, you really had to be into music, a borderline musician, to listen to the music that was most of the music, not all of it. But here, interesting thing, these days, someone who listens to the early Fleetwood Mac or music of that kind, right? They typically considered or would like to consider themselves as serious musicians. But if you look at the early music videos from 68, 69, the big hits, maybe not the Green Militia was already in the end, but Oh Well and those kind of songs that came out earlier, you can see they're in regular dance clubs and they have all these flashy, fashiony, young chicks. What do they know about music? They're just dancing and shaking their ass to the music. So even what we consider as serious and high quality music definitely had that aspect to it. But of course, then it became, everything went on steroids. Then of course there is an aspect that is not necessarily directly tied to music, but I mentioned it in another video. Actually, that video is not out yet. I'm still working on that series about optics, but I mentioned the law of diminishing returns. Whenever you purchase something a little bit serious, something that costs a couple $1,000 or even an automobile, things of that nature, whatever money you put in, you don't get out that much if you establish a baseline. If you want to purchase something new, whether it's something like a binocular or a rifle or an automobile, and you have option A for $1,000 and then option B for $2,000, option B is not going to be twice as good. So the same thing applies here, right? Just because something is better than the other one, or that you invest more, you're not going to get twice as much out of it. And this is kind of what happened in a way in the 80s. Everyone started to run after certain things. The synthesizer, right? That's one of the big criticisms. Everybody started to make a synthesizer, and of course you had to buy the limited amount of synthesizers that were available on the market, so everything started to sound the same thing. Plus, one had success with a certain thing, and then everybody had to copy that. And that's actually, I mentioned it in the video with John Wetton. That's the video with John Wetton and Greg Lake. John Wetton has a famous interview where he was asked whether Asia was trying to follow a certain formula, right? And it was in the context of his second record, The first record was amazing, but the second record kind of went a little bit too much on that overproduced, over cheesy, over slick, over smooth kind of sounds. A lot of synthesizers, these big choruses. So someone asked him if there was a formula. So John Wetton answered that, oh, that there's no formula. If there was a formula, everybody would follow it and be successful. Well, no, absolutely not. He's wrong. And in my opinion, he was lying. Of course, there is a formula, and of course, they try to apply it to Asia. It's just there's no guarantee that you will be successful. Why? For the specific reason that I just mentioned. Everybody's trying to do the same thing, so no one's going to guarantee you. But the successful, what is it called, commercial market definitely had a formula or a number of formulas or a general aspect to it. That's why everything sounded the same. That's why they all tried to do this. Even respected musicians, they made the solo albums, the members of the Eagles, and many other bands. But all in all, there were good bands. There was Blue Murder, many good bands. Badlands. There were a lot of good bands. Not all of them made it big. Not all of them were great. Even Motley Crue was good in the beginning. Dio, Wasp. We just made the video last week. So, of course, a lot of bands faltered. That's when the notion of selling out became known and became popularized. All the metal bands that started to incorporate synthesizers in their music started to be accused of selling out. And of course, the backlash, the counter reaction or counterculture to that, if you want, was the extreme metal, which kind of started towards the middle of the 80s, right? I just mentioned to you Metallica and Megadeth, but a lot of bands took it to much further distances, right? You had Slayer and Obituary and all of these, I forgot what it's called, dark metal or black metal or goth metal or God only knows what. It was essentially the same thing, just on the other direction, right? You had, for example, here's a good example for you. You have, what's his name? King Diamond and Fate, Merciful Fate. There you go. Merciful Fate and King Diamond, right? They also had the makeup and all of that, but they didn't use it like Kiss and all of those other musics. They weren't yet the extreme metal, but they were kind of pushing a little bit in that direction with their image, right? You could make the case that Ghost is sort of a modern day reincarnation or maybe even a parody of King Diamond and Merciful Fate. And by the way, at a certain point, his guitar player, which is pretty good, Sherman. I forgot his first name. Tony Sherman maybe, or Johnny Sherman. No, it's not. It's none of those days. But anyway, Sherman, he left Merciful Fate and he made his own band, just plain Fate. Super cheesy, super commercial, but it's still a good record. At least the one that I heard. I think it's the first one. So you had that aspect, right? You had good music that was watered down, and you had great guitar players. You had like Reb Beach, you had Doug Aldrich, of course Steve Vai. You got all that crazy virtuoso style that was pushed or popularized at least by Van Halen, right? So the technical proficiency went through the roof, and yeah, of course you can make the case that, hey, listen, this happened with the old guitar players, right? Richie Blackmore, or he himself became kind of very commercial in the 80s, and you had many other, right? Jimmy Page was kind of very famous, and there were a couple others. So of course in the 80s it came back with a vengeance. Everybody wanted to be like a super technical, super proficient guitar player, and then of course because of that proliferation, instead of becoming truly independent and truly original, they kind of copied each other and kept doing the same thing, right? Ingrid Malmsteen, and you can just rattle off all of these names. Nuno Bettencourt. They didn't really bring something truly fresh and new to the table. And when they tried, it wasn't always good, right? You have Primus, whom I always respected them as great musicians, but the music itself, it's like, I almost never have the urge to go to the shelf and take off a Primus record and play it. When someone plays it, oh man, this bass player, he's phenomenal, he's fantastic, and it's kind of great ideas, but it's still doesn't gel together as well to make a finished good, a finished song or a finished record that you could say, you know what, this record was a banger, I want to play it again. And of course, like I said, there are the cultural associations, the clothing and the haircuts that were a little bit outrageous and too flashy. But again, it was a reflection of the good times that were rolling. And then in the 90s, we got into a situation where we took it all for granted, and we had to bash it and talk down to it. It's like many other cliches. There might be some truth to it, but it's not universally true, and it's way over exaggerated. So whenever people say things of its nature, just think it through and think how true it is before just mindlessly repeating it, and just running with the pack and running with the herd and running with the pre-established notions. The 80s made some great music. It made it accessible to a lot of people. There were great concerts when they made here Heavy Metal Parking Lot or Iron Maiden's World Slavery Tours. When these huge tours became big, people loved it. People didn't talk down to it. People went out to have a good time, and people enjoyed it. People came together. So all of that is a product mostly of the 80s. Of course, it started already in the 70s, but when it really exploded, and again, it exploded because of something that essentially is good. Of course, it has negative aspects to it. Oh, here's one thing that no one's going to tell you today on anywhere on the political spectrum, whether they be extreme right, extreme left, in the middle, or claim to be in the middle. But pretty much anything and everything that happens in modern society is because we have it so good that the material advancement and the economic advancement far outpaces our spiritual advancement. So I would say even the opposite, that the material advancement in some way doesn't create, but it encourages some spiritual numbness. People don't read books anymore. People don't invest time in improving themselves as in the sense of being a better human being. Of course there is, but the notion is out there, but most of what I see is fake. Oh, be nice and be kind, and behind it is typically there is a political agenda. You have to be kind to certain kinds of people and certain groups of people, and then you have to signal your kindness to those people. You have to put a big flag in front of your house to show that it has many colors and you accept everybody, which really just means that you hate everybody who's not like you and doesn't agree with your agenda. Or people who put out these big signs in front of their front yards. It's, we believe in science, and science says that if you put a diaper on your face, then that's going to save you from the Black Death, which let's not even go there. But this is pretty much it. So people like to spread cliches and platitudes that don't have much meaning, don't have much substance to them. And this is one of them. I hope I was able to debunk it for you. And I'll debunk another one in a little while. But in the meantime, let's go back to talk about rock bands. And so until the next time, rock on, my friend.